It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm Akhtar Badshah. I am on the board of Global Washington. There are times in life when you get connected to an individual. I was introduced to Degan in April of this year. I was asked to meet her through a mutual friend, somebody that had previously worked at the Gates Foundation. And I begrudgingly went to that meeting. It was a Friday evening. It was pouring rain in April. I was exhausted. So I said, I will go and spend 10 minutes, make some excuse, and go home. Degan is a force of nature. When I met her in the lobby at the hotel, her smile was captivating, warm, and just drew me in. For the next hour and a half, I sat and listened to her journey and the work that she has done to transform the lives of millions of people around the world. April 20th, 2022 was a very fortuitous day for me. It was also a very important day for all of us in Seattle, because since that meeting, this is the fourth time Degan has been back to Seattle. She now has a little place for herself on the plane, and she has a little place in Seattle. You will hear from Degan why what she is doing is so important, and why she is at the forefront of what we have been talking about all day: co-creation, but more importantly, how do we move from giving people in the global south a voice to actually trusting them? So Degan is here to share with us how we can all collectively move from amplifying voice to really focus on trust. With that, please join me in welcoming Degan Ali.
Thank you, Akhtar. I'm so touched. It was a mutually amazing day, April 20th. I can't believe he remembers the actual date. I can't remember who I met yesterday. So I'm really honored and privileged to be here with you today. And I want to first thank Kristen and Global Washington for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today, as they understand that we are a pivotal juncture that demands change. Also, I want to thank the Chandler Foundation and the Gates Foundation, who have been ready to take a leap of faith and lean into uncertainty by giving us a platform, such as this beautiful magazine, The Social Investor, and funding to help Adesso develop solutions to shifting power and resources to proximate groups. I lead a local organization called Adesso that's based in Kenya, that was founded by my mother, Fatima Jibril, who's a renowned and award-winning environmental activist. My ambition to always follow in her footsteps and work to help my people was a core part of my ambition for my career. However, I also thought that the best way to do this was to work with the UN. the UN was the most prestigious and well-paid institution that I knew. After a lot of difficulty, due to some racism, I landed a position with the UN. I soon realized that the UN was not for me. While I was having doors wide open for me and fundraising so easily because of my association with the UN, my mother was simultaneously being refused entry into meetings and having doors slam in her face. I realized after a few years that I could not stand by and watch the humiliating treatment my mother was facing. And I had to leave the UN and help her develop ADESO. Once I joined ADESO, I was suddenly propelled from a very comfortable position of automatic trust, access, and privilege to a world where I was seen to be untrustworthy, risky, and with almost no access to important spaces. This experience deeply formed my thinking and drive to change the system. This is not a theoretical exercise for me, but a personal journey to ensure that what my mother and I experienced is never again experienced by my sisters and brothers in the Global South. Over these 2 days together, the focus has been on co-creation and partnership. As we think about the opportunities that co-creation and partnership can bring, I want us to leverage these powerful tools in ways that can design a new system and can ensure we learn from history. In the spirit of being trailblazing and leaning into uncertainty, instead of log frames and theories of change, I would like us to use this opportunity to describe the new architecture and ways of working in our communities that is based on abundance and trust rather than scarcity and risk. If you haven't listened to a podcast I did recently with the New Humanitarian, where I talk about the years of failed aid and humanitarian response in my country, Somalia, which is the only country in the world to have experienced 2 famines in modern history. And now the UN is saying that there might be a 3rd famine coming. You should listen to it. The current reality is that the humanitarian and development assistance mostly finances global north infrastructure with highly paid and well-meaning people that provides very little tangible benefits to people and communities on the ground. The aid system has created a horrible level of dependency where people have no incentive to go back to their farms and produce when they can get more resources from the aid system in a camp. Similarly, it has created layers and layers of intermediation where the last mile groups risking their lives delivering services to communities or local organizations get the least amount of resources in that intermediation process, including 0 overheads. Basically, as local organizations, we're expected to work for free to deliver these programs and be invisible donors to projects funded by big bilateral donors such as USAID, UK Aid, and EU. However, as the alternatives to this intermediation is not in sight for many of the leaders of these local organizations, they accept the status quo and become dependent on the system and continue to anxiously wait for the next UN or INGO project that brings crumbs to their organizations. The last group in this chain is the community, who usually only interacts with these local organizations that receive resources for projects that have already been designed in other capitals without any real understanding of their own agency and power. They are given assistance based on what these global north agencies think is best for communities, and it is rarely with the mindset of how do we help communities thrive, but rather how do we help them survive? There is almost an unspoken rule that people in our countries don't deserve to be thriving, and that they should be satisfied and grateful for the minimum of surviving. Now imagine we flip this entire paradigm upside down and create this new architecture based on abundance and trust. First, instead of going to communities with a needs assessment, a checklist, we ask them, what are you already doing to survive a crisis? We assume that they have agency and power rather than they have nothing, that they're in deficit. Instead of designing a project in these capitals, we give them the money to continue doing what they're already doing for themselves. We don't ask them to move to an IDP camp so they're easy to see and easy for us to count them, leaving their existing means of production and social support they're benefiting from in ways that the aid system doesn't understand or value. Imagine if we start working with local communities to develop real solutions that can be engines of economic growth and creating jobs. Imagine if we find the entrepreneurs in these communities and invest in their ideas and solutions instead of developing a UN, INGO, or a Commonics-managed economic growth project. Imagine if we actually fund global movements that are advocating for food sovereignty and who are looking to revamp the global governance system, the Bretton Woods institutions, so they're aligned to principles of equity and growth for all, and not just serving the interests of former colonizers and imperialists. Second, instead of putting resources solely into these expensive and inflexible institutions, such as the UN, Global North NGOs and contractors, again, such as Chemonics, resources move directly to the frontline organizations working with these communities. Not only do they know what is best to do to support their communities, they know how to do it best. Instead of thinking them as risky and not to be trusted, we need to think of them as creative, innovative, committed, and efficient engines of social development that make miracles happen with limited resources. Mahnaz, the CEO of the Mona Foundation, this morning during breakfast, told a story how the Mona Foundation educates 80,000 children with an annual budget of $2.6 million. How do they do that? Because they believe that it's not only the right thing to do to have local partners lead, but also the most cost-efficient way of working. So I'll tell you a story here about a friend of mine. Her name is Brenda from Liberia. I met her when we were founding the NEAR Network, and she was telling me how she started her organization in Liberia called KEEP. She started this NGO that was providing education during the Ebola response. How did she start this organization? The Ebola crisis was happening. Everybody was at home. Nobody could go out the kids could not be in school. She was working with a large corporation, sitting at home with her children, and so she decided to find online a curriculum for Liberia, and she started printing the curriculum at home every single day for her child. And then she said, oh, why am I not helping the children in my neighborhood? So she started doing the same. And they created a support system so that the neighborhood parents were basically educating their children from home, and she was providing the tools. Then she went to the larger community. Before she knew it, she was providing education during the Ebola crisis to thousands of children through a volunteer program with zero external funding. And then she said, Degan, do you know how much UNICEF and ex-INGO, I won't name names, got for education in her country for children experiencing the Ebola crisis? She mentioned some crazy number of millions of dollars. And she said, none of us in our communities have seen these organizations. That's KEEP, K-E-E-P in Liberia. These stories are everywhere in every country, but you will never hear about KEEP when the New York Times and the Guardians talk about the Ebola response. But you will hear of some great work of global North brand organizations that erase the ingenuity and resourcefulness of local organizations and local communities. Decolonizing philanthropy and aid is not just about shifting resources to frontline communities and organizations, but it is about recognizing and appreciating how inequity and injustice has been deliberately built into our global aid architecture. Lastly, it is essential that our paradigm shift needs to help organizations and communities thrive and be liberated. Liberation can only occur if we invest in the long-term financial independence of organizations and institutions in these countries. This is one of 9 principles in my article, Shifting Sands, Shifting Power, in the Social Investor magazine. We need to fund for self-determination so that organizations have unrestricted funding that allows them to develop an endowment. My goal for Adesso is to use our $5 million McKinsey Scott gift to eventually have a $50 million endowment so that we are no longer in a position of just being a passive recipient, but are co-financing and co-creating solutions with other funders, leveraging our own resources. We will only be real equals in the system when we bring our money to the table. This is where philanthropy becomes a critical ally in the shift. Philanthropy and global actors in the sector have the flexibility to undertake what seems risky by modeling new ways of working, following in the path of trailblazers such as the Mona Foundation and many others, Global Fund for Women, the feminist movements are so far ahead of us. All restrictions that philanthropy places on itself are purely self-prescribed. While restrictions placed on bilaterals require legal or policy changes that are much more difficult to make. I take my hat off to Samantha Powers. What she's trying to do with USAID is not an easy thing, but it's much easier for philanthropy. Philanthropy needs to model and demonstrate that making big bets on new ways of working is not only equitable, but also impactful. At Adesso, we are a deep believer in action, and propelling action requires solutions. Also, helping philanthropy in this journey to move resources more approximately is a core part of our strategy as Adesso. This is why we're hoping to work with Gates and others in creating large-scale pathways of mobilizing philanthropic funds to proximate groups. In addition to founding and incubating the NEAR network, which is the first global South civil society network that is trying to change the humanitarian and development system, we are now also involved in developing and incubating 2 other solutions. We're designing solutions that will support the infrastructure of this new ecosystem that is centered in equity and community. One is called Kuja Link, which is an online platform like LinkedIn, where local organizations and activists can upload their profiles so that funders can locate them and make a connection that hopefully leads to funding to these organizations directly. We need to remove the layers of intermediation. We hope to have 2,000 organization profiles on the platform by February and 10,000 by 2023. Please help us by getting your partner organizations to develop their profiles on Kuja Link. We are also developing a management service company called CORE, where local organizations can outsource critical functions like finance, procurement, and HR that make them non-compliant and high risk to receive large bilateral funding from the likes of USAID and DFID. By outsourcing these functions to CORE, these organizations after a year can transition from being high risk to hopefully being low risk and receiving funding. In our effort to influence our sister and brother organizations in the global north, also referred to as INGOs, we embarked on a 1.5-year-long process with CEOs of few of these organizations on how they can decolonize their business models. This process culminated in what is called the Pledge for Change 2030, where INGOs have made commitments on how they will change their behaviors and practices in our countries. Now we are working on an accountability mechanism led by the Global South that has real teeth in ensuring that these INGOs truly change their DNA by 2030. At Adesso, we continue to not just be a source of truth-telling, but also a source of co-creating solutions to help our partners undergo this transformation. Now is the time to fund courageously and trust generously. And finally, remove our self-imposed ideas of scarcity and risk. It is possible to not just imagine a new way of working, but to also move from imagination into action. We ask that you go on this journey with us to help you find new purpose-driven and transformative ways of giving and working with communities. We deeply believe it is possible to create an Africa that is not dependent on aid, but on the resourcefulness and capabilities of its people. Let's work together to remove ourselves from the broken shackles of aid to a world based on equity, solidarity, and trust. Thank you.
I was just slipped a note by Kristen to follow that. This is our moment. This is our moment in time to seize an opportunity to shift how every single one of us thinks about the capacity, the creativity, and the compassionate of every other human being around the world. Degan is challenging us to rise to that occasion. Trust. Trust with building capacity. Trust by providing resources. And then have the absolute courage of stepping back. Have the absolute courage of not worrying about failure. Have the absolute courage of trusting that humanity will rise if given the support structure that is adequate. We at Global Washington believe in that. We continue to bring thinkers, leaders, provocators to our community in Seattle, in Washington State, to continue to foster this conversation so that it does not just remain a conversation, but it turns into action. And the only way it turns into action is all of you, all of us, together, take that first step. Hope you all enjoyed the conversation, and I really invite you to take that step. Let's change the world. Thank you all very much.